At 3:17 a.m. local time, the Northern Caribbean seemed almost frozen in place. The sea was smooth, the sky was moonless, and no visible traffic appeared anywhere nearby. From the flight deck of USS George Washington, it looked like another standard nighttime transit. Steel cutting through dark water, escort ships maintaining formation, radar contacts clean, familiar, easy to dismiss. Yet below the surface, the ocean was already telling a very different story. Inside the carrier's Combat Direction Center, the low hum of electronics filled the room. Consoles cast green and amber light as sonar operators monitored a steady flow of acoustic information. Ambient noise, thermal layers, distant merchant traffic. For a while, everything appeared normal. Then one trace on the display began acting in a way that did not fit the pattern. At first, it did not seem threatening. There were no sharp spikes, no abrupt turns, no clear signs of hostile intent. Just a faint but persistent acoustic anomaly sitting at the far edge of the strike group's passive detection range. Too slow to be surface traffic, too controlled to be marine life. The contact made no signal, rushed nothing, transmitted nothing. It simply maintained depth and moved quietly closer. On the sonar screen, the line barely moved. That was precisely why it drew attention. At sea, motion is expected. Even submarines drift, currents interfere, and sound patterns naturally fluctuate. But this contact adjusted just enough to remain aligned with the strike group's movement. It was not closing fast. It was not falling away. It was matching. That pattern triggered a quiet shift in posture. No alarm sounded through the ship. No dramatic announcement interrupted the calm. There was only a subtle tightening in the room as senior watch officers leaned forward and studied the data more carefully. Passive tracking only, no active sonar. That decision mattered. A single active ping would not only light up the unknown contact, but also reveal the strike group's own position, intentions, and capabilities to anyone else listening in the area. And in waters like these, someone is always listening. The strike group was operating legally in international waters. No exercise was underway, no drill in progress, no deliberate show of force. But under the sea, intent is rarely stated directly. It is understood through timing, spacing, angles, and silence. The contact remained quiet. No cavitation, no machinery signature linked to surface propulsion, no messy acoustic clutter like the kind often produced by civilian submersibles. This was disciplined silence. Within minutes, analysts began narrowing the profile. The sound pattern was consistent with a diesel-electric submarine operating on battery power, one of the quietest modes available. Not nuclear, limited endurance, built for stealth rather than speed, a platform more suited to coastal operations. That detail changed the picture. Diesel-electric submarines do not travel far from supportive waters without a reason. Battery endurance is limited. Every minute spent submerged without snorkeling is a deliberate choice, which meant this approach was not accidental. It was intentional. The geometry supported that conclusion. The contact was not simply crossing the carrier's path. It was not drifting toward the wake. It was angling toward the outer defensive ring, close enough to observe, but not close enough to force an automatic reaction. Classic gray zone behavior. Inside the command spaces, the mood sharpened, not into panic, but into focus. Every bearing shift was logged. Every slight change in sound was recorded. Timestamps mattered. In modern naval encounters, information can matter just as much as presence. No one raised their voice, no one rushed. The U.S. Navy trains constantly for moments like this, not the dramatic ones that dominate headlines, but the quiet ones that rarely do. The kind where a single choice can turn a routine transit into an international incident. Send up a helicopter too early, and it may look like escalation. Use active sonar too aggressively, and it may be interpreted as provocation. Ignore the contact, and the risk only grows. So the strike group did what it does best. It waited. Above the surface, sailors continued their watch. Below, something unseen was probing limits, moving deeper into the strike group's defensive geometry, measuring reactions, timing, and discipline. The most dangerous phase of an encounter is not always the moment force is used. Sometimes it is the moment when nothing visible happens at all. And somewhere beneath the Caribbean, a Venezuelan submarine was about to learn exactly how much silence the U.S. Navy was prepared to accept. By 3:29 a.m., the pattern was undeniable. In sonar control, analysts compared the track history with the strike group's course. The result was clear. Every minor course adjustment by USS George Washington was being echoed. Seconds later, corrected by degrees, refined with precision. This was not drift. This was deliberate shadowing. The contact maintained a steady depth just beneath the thermocline, a calculated position. Thermal layers bend sound waves and distort returns, reducing detection range. Whoever was in command of that submarine clearly understood the environment and how to use it to their advantage. Passive sonar remained the primary tool. No active pings, no sudden changes in emissions. In situations like this, the priority is not confrontation. It's clarity. And clarity takes patience. The acoustic signature stayed faint but consistent. A low-frequency hum, carefully controlled. No sudden spikes that would suggest outdated systems or poor handling. This wasn't an aging platform struggling to stay hidden. It was a well-maintained vessel, operated by a crew trained to stay precise under pressure. Every few minutes, the sonar team logged subtle adjustments, slight bearing changes that kept the submarine aligned with the carrier's movement. It wasn't closing aggressively, it wasn't retreating, it was holding position. In undersea operations, that kind of behavior sends a clear message. A submarine trying to disappear usually breaks contact entirely. One preparing for a direct strike moves fast and unpredictably. But a submarine focused on observation, studying reaction times, patterns, and limits behaves like this. Close enough to gather information, distant enough to avoid committing. Inside the Combat Direction Center, silent simulations were already running. If the contact continued on its current path, it would soon reach the outer boundary of the strike group's inner defensive zone. Still within legal limits, still not openly hostile, but close enough to shrink the time available for decisions. Above deck, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Aircraft remained parked. Flight operations stayed inactive. To an outside observer, the strike group might have seemed quiet, almost idle. In reality, it was anything but. Escort ships made slight adjustments, fractions of a mile, subtle enough to go unnoticed by civilian tracking systems. But beneath the surface, those small changes reshaped the entire acoustic landscape. This is how experienced navies apply pressure without drawing attention. The submarine responded almost immediately. Its track shifted slightly, correcting to maintain the same relative position. That response removed any remaining doubt. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate interaction. Still, no alarms sounded, no ship-wide alerts. The rules of engagement were clear. Presence alone does not justify escalation. And once escalation begins at sea, it can be difficult to control. So everything was recorded instead. Timestamps, bearing shifts, acoustic variations, every detail carefully logged. Because in modern naval encounters, what gets documented in real time can later become strategic leverage, diplomatic, legal, or operational. At 3:41 a.m., the contact made a subtle but important move. It slowed, not drastically, but enough to alter the closing rate. That small change forced a reassessment. Slowing while maintaining position suggests two possibilities: conserving battery or reassessing the situation. Either way, it pointed to limits. Diesel-electric submarines operating on battery powertrain endurance for silence. Every minute submerged becomes part of a countdown. The commander below was making careful decisions, balancing proximity with survival. On the carrier, that shift was noted, not as a trigger for a dramatic response, but as an opportunity for positioning. If the submarine wanted to remain undetected, it would eventually need to withdraw or accept increasing risk. If it chose to move closer, it would have to reveal something: speed, depth, or noise. The U.S. Navy didn't force that decision. It allowed the situation to unfold. Silence, used correctly, becomes a tool. It pressures the other side to act first, and in doing so, to reveal either control or vulnerability. Below the surface, the contact remains steady, controlled, and quiet. But the ocean leaves little room for error. The closer any submarine moves toward a carrier strike group, the fewer options remain. Every defensive layer reduces reaction time. Every mile narrows the margin. Somewhere beneath the Caribbean, the margin was shrinking, whether the crew below fully recognized it or not. By 3:56 a.m., the geometry had tightened even further. The contact was no longer operating on the edge of uncertainty. Its position now placed it in a zone where every additional mile reduced the time available for response for both sides. Within a carrier strike group, distance isn't just distance, it's time. And time is everything. Aboard USS George Washington, the command team reviewed the situation in silence. No discussion was needed. The data spoke clearly. The submarine had made its choice. Not an overt move, but a commitment to proximity. That distinction mattered. In U.S. Navy doctrine, intent isn't assumed, it's demonstrated. And so far, the contact had shown control, discipline, and restraint. In the undersea domain, those qualities carry weight. Passive sonar continued to carry the load. The signature remained tight, carefully managed. No erratic maneuvers, no unnecessary noise. Whoever was below understood that the moment discipline slipped, the balance would shift instantly. But discipline is never one-sided. The strike group began to reshape the situation with quiet, exact control. Escort ships adjusted course by the smallest margins, changes that would have looked meaningless from above. But below the surface, those slight movements changed the entire picture. Acoustic baselines shifted, relative bearings tightened. An unseen net was starting to close, not fast, not aggressively, but with clear purpose. The submarine reacted once more, a small change in depth, A slight correction in bearing, just enough to stay aligned. That response answered an important question. This was not a submarine that had wandered off course. It was not a crew dealing with confusion or failure. Whoever was in command knew exactly where they were and understood exactly what they were moving toward. At that distance, every possible move carried weight. If the U.S. Navy switched fully to active sonar, the contact would be exposed at once, its position carried through the water for anyone nearby to detect. Ambiguity would disappear, pressure would rise. If a helicopter launched too early, the message would be obvious. If nothing changed, the submarine could keep edging inward until the margin for error was gone. This was the tightest moment of the encounter. In modern naval confrontations, escalation rarely begins with obvious force. It begins with signals, with posture, with the question of who can make the other side respond first. And the U.S. Navy does not make that move casually. Inside the Combat Direction Center, commanders approved a quiet shift in posture. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the outside, but the change was real. Anti-submarine teams moved from observation to readiness. Air crews were notified, but not launched. Sensors were positioned, but not yet switched on. Everything was prepared. Nothing was announced. That is what restraint looks like when it is deliberate. The submarine, still moving in silence, began to feel the pressure. Not through sound, but through geometry. The water around it was no longer open and neutral. It had become organized, layered, and closely watched. At 4:07 a.m., the contact slowed again. This time, the drop was easier to notice. That mattered. Slowing at that depth and at that range strongly suggested battery preservation was becoming a factor. It also hinted that the submarine commander was reassessing the risk. Continuing to shadow the strike group was no longer without cost. Every additional minute in that position increased the chance of full identification, if not immediately, then later, through recorded data and after-action analysis. The U.S. Navy recognized the hesitation and did not rush to take advantage of it. Instead, the strike group held course, held speed, held silence. That forced the submarine into a narrowing choice: pull away and preserve deniability, or move closer and reveal more of itself. By then, there was no real middle ground left. Under the sea, shadows only exist where clarity is missing, and the deeper that submarine moved into the carrier's defensive geometry, the brighter the invisible spotlight became. This was no longer a contest of force, it was a contest of nerve. And somewhere beneath the Caribbean, a Venezuelan submarine commander was starting to understand that silence alone would no longer be enough. The decision point was closing fast, and when it arrived, one side would have to blink. At 4:14 a.m., the contact broke its own pattern. It was not loud, it was not dramatic. But beneath the surface, even the smallest deviation can mean everything. Inside sonar control, one operator leaned in. A new trace appeared. Brief, imperfect, but unmistakable. A transient noise spike. Not propulsion, not a launch. Just a short lapse in acoustic discipline. For the first time that night, the submarine had given away something real. No one in the room reacted emotionally. They reacted with precision. That single anomaly was enough. Aboard USS George Washington, commanders approved a measured response. Not meant to threaten, but to clarify. Not a show of force for effect. Confirmation. Active sonar was authorized. One short pulse. Narrow beam. Minimal duration. The ocean answered immediately. The contact's position came into focus at once. Not as a vague possibility, but as a defined shape with clear depth and bearing. The uncertainty that had protected the submarine for nearly an hour disappeared in a matter of seconds. Now the U.S. Navy knew exactly where it was. More importantly, the submarine now knew that the U.S. Navy knew. That changed everything. Almost immediately, the contact changed depth, dropping enough to move away from the layer it had been using for cover. It was a smart defensive move, but too late to erase what had already been revealed. The response grew not in noise, but in presence. An MH-60 Seahawk lifted quietly from the deck of an escort ship, its rotors cutting through the darkness just above the horizon. No lights, no radio drama, just a dark outline moving into position. To a civilian, a helicopter launch might seem dramatic. In naval doctrine, it is controlled language. It delivers a message that is simple and impossible to miss. We are here. We are watching. You are no longer unseen. From the submarine's perspective, everything had just changed. The moment a helicopter entered the equation, time compressed and options narrowed. With dipping sonar and sonobuoys available, the underwater environment became tighter, faster, and far less forgiving. For a brief moment, the contact hesitated. Then it turned. The bearing shifted away from the strike group. Slowly at first, controlled, almost cautious, as if testing whether the response would escalate further. It didn't. The Seahawk held its position. The strike group stayed on course. The restraint remained steady and deliberate. As the submarine continued its turn, analysts noticed a slight increase in speed. A small detail, but an important one. Battery power was no longer being conserved, it was being used. The objective had shifted. This was no longer observation, it was separation. Within minutes, the distance began to open. No weapons were prepared for use. No warnings were broadcast, though they could have been. The submarine slipped back toward deeper water, its acoustic trace fading as it moved away from the strike group's defensive structure. It wasn't pursued. It wasn't pressured. It was simply allowed to leave. That, too, was intentional. Because in encounters like this, the goal is not to embarrass the other side. It is to maintain control, clearly, quietly, and without unnecessary display. By 4:29 a.m., the contact had moved outside the critical zone. Still detectable, still monitored, but no longer a concern. The Seahawk returned to its ship. Active sonar was secured. The strike group settled back into its original posture, as if nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. Above the surface, the night remained calm. To anyone far away, there was no indication that anything unusual had occurred. But beneath that calm, the outcome was clear. The Venezuelan submarine had come close enough to test boundaries, close enough to gather information, close enough to believe it might remain undetected. What it learned instead was something far more significant. It learned how quickly concealment can disappear, how little space exists near a carrier strike group, and how a situation can be resolved without any dramatic show of force. The most decisive moments at sea are rarely loud. They are often defined by what doesn't happen. And when this one ended, only one side walked away with a complete picture. Fully mapped, fully understood, and firmly in control. By dawn, the Caribbean looked unchanged. The water was calm, the air still, and the strike group continued its transit as if the night had passed without incident. No alerts, no statements, no visible signs of tension. That was exactly the point. Aboard USS George Washington, the event had already shifted from action to analysis. Sonar records were secured. Acoustic signatures were cataloged. Timelines were synchronized across platforms. Every bearing adjustment, every depth change, every moment of hesitation had been captured. In modern naval operations, that kind of data carries real weight. The Venezuelan submarine had not taken aggressive action. It had not violated international law. On paper, the encounter could be described as routine presence. In reality, it was something more calculated. This was a gray zone probe, a deliberate attempt to operate just below the level that would trigger a stronger response. Close enough to observe, quiet enough to avoid clear intent, bold enough to send a message without creating open tension. That message was received. But another message was sent back, one the submarine's crew would carry with them. They learned that proximity works both ways, that concealment becomes fragile when multiple defensive layers begin shaping the environment around you, and that a carrier strike group does not need to chase in order to control the situation. The response was not designed to provoke or embarrass. It was designed to define boundaries, to show that while restraint guides action, awareness remains constant. There was no celebration. Professional forces don't treat outcomes like this as victories to display. The absence of escalation isn't something to showcase. It's confirmation that discipline held. And discipline made all the difference. If the submarine had moved closer, the response would have tightened. If its acoustic signature had slipped further, the situation would have accelerated. If the reaction from the strike group had been emotional instead of measured, the encounter could have shifted into a direct standoff in a matter of minutes. Instead, both sides were left with a clear understanding of the limits. For Venezuela, the takeaway was straightforward. Operating near a carrier strike group is not symbolic. It's operating near the edge of what is sustainable. Every step closer increases exposure. Every additional minute raises the stakes. For the United States, the lesson was equally clear. Presence alone does not create deterrence. Discipline does. The ability to observe without overreacting, to wait without losing control, to apply pressure without relying on spectacle. Those are the tools that matter. This encounter didn't end with headlines. It ended with distance. And that distance carried more meaning than any public statement could. The submarine returned to deeper water with more than just collected data. It carried a direct understanding of how quickly the balance shifts, when concealment meets structure, and when intent meets preparation. Moments like this rarely make the news. They don't leave behind dramatic images or simple narratives. But they quietly shape the maritime environment all the same. Because modern naval competition isn't always about who acts first. Sometimes it's about who controls the moment when no one does. The Caribbean will likely see encounters like this again. Different ships, different crews, the same calculations, measured pressure, controlled responses, boundaries tested, but not crossed. That night, when a Venezuelan submarine moved toward a U.S. carrier, ended without open confrontation, but it did not end without impact. At sea, silence is never empty. Sometimes it says everything.